So, welcome everyone to another Mentor Core event. This time, I am thrilled to have Samantha Kellen with us here today. Mentor Core, if this is your first time joining us, is a community for compliance, security, and risk professionals. We've cultivated a community of caring where it is safe to grow and develop on your own terms. My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. I own a compliance, ethics, and corporate governance consulting firm, and I am the co founder of MentorCore with my dear
Hi.
friend.
Hi. I'm Dan Ayala. I have I'm the founder of Socratic, a security and privacy and virtual CISO and virtual privacy officer consultancy, and the other co-founder of MentorCore. And we've got with us today just an amazing discussion. I don't know about you, but in every occasion in which we have a discussion with one or two or three professionals, it always seems to turn to the idea that what if they find out that I'm not good enough in the role I'm in? This whole idea of imposter syndrome is ripe throughout all of these industries. I know I suffer from it quite a lot, and it's hard to say that. And we are joined by Samantha Kellen, who is she's confident in our abilities and thinks you should too. You should be too. Samantha, welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited for this conversation. And yes, I feel like my name should be like Samantha Imposter Syndrome Kellen, because it's definitely something I have suffered with and continue to challenge on a daily basis. But I'm excited to be here to talk about why I believe in you and why you should too, because thankfully I've had a number of wise people in my life who have believed in me until I could believe in myself. And I'm hoping to be a voice for everyone who's here today to encourage you to do the same.
Thanks. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days, and some of your background.
Sure. So I started in compliance 13 or 14 years ago. It was totally by chance. I was definitely not one of those kids who was like, oh, I want to grow up and be a compliance officer one day. Like, that wasn't even on my radar. I was the kid who brought home all the strays and thought they wanted to go to vet school until they realized it was really expensive and really long, and decided that wasn't for me. But I grew up horseback riding. That was like my hobby and my passion for most of my life up until a few years ago. And I thought that some version of that career would probably be where I ended up. My college experience was anything but linear. I certainly was not your, go right to high school and graduate in 4 years and then find your perfect career. I was not, quite frankly, emotionally prepared for college. And so when I got there, I was one of many. I went to a big state school and I got very lost. I was a great student. I love learning, but the setting wasn't right for me. And I wasn't ready either. I really admire the kids who are 18 and who go and do it well. And so I failed out at least once, depending on which record you look at. My transcript from college.
You have some consistency issues with the
records?
records?
Yeah, it's literally, if you look at all of my transcripts, there are either A's and B's or F's and W's. There's no C's and D's. It was really, I had it all together or I didn't. That was really what it looked like for me. And, due to some family circumstances in my junior-ish year, because I don't even really know, there were some things going on with my family, and I used that as an opportunity to go do the riding thing for a while. I thought, let me go do this professionally for a while. And turns out that it's not nearly as fun to do it as a job as it is to do it as a hobby. And so I said, all right, let me go back and finish my undergrad. And so I did. I got a temp job for an organization that provided services to individuals with developmental disabilities during the day. And then at night, I went back and finished my undergrad degree. And it just so happened that the temp job was as the administrative assistant to a compliance officer. And that was how I was introduced to this type of work. And I stayed in that role for 3 years and I learned a lot. I wasn't just an admin, but I really wasn't a compliance specialist either, but it was enough to kind of get my feet wet around policy writing and audits and stuff like that. And I really just liked the exposure it gave you to the rest of the business. And quite frankly, I really liked being the person that everybody came to for help. Like my ego, that just made me feel like really like I knew what was going on, you know? And I also am pretty good at translating complex requirements into things that are easy for folks to understand. So I was always that kid in class who would raise their hand and be like, so what you really mean is dot, dot, dot. And then you would hear the rest of the kids be like, oh, that makes sense, you know? And so I've always had a good translation ability. And so it just sort of fit. I moved down to South Florida and I kept working on my compliance career. I got a real compliance specialist job, and I've really never looked back. As far as corporate America goes, I've never worked in anything that wasn't compliance. And over time, I've just grown to love it more and more. And I've pursued other certifications. I'm a certified compliance and ethics professional. I actually, unlike my undergrad career, I pursued an online master's degree in business ethics and compliance that I completed on time. One action, right, completed. And that was a really awesome experience for me. And again, you know, when I've got it together, I can do things like that. And then, you know, I now am the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at an organization called Cardinal Innovations Healthcare. I started in this role about a year and a half ago or so. And I work for a phenomenal team. It's a great organization. It's been a really awesome learning opportunity for me, a great experience for me to get my feet wet in this type of role. And I'm so thrilled and grateful for the opportunity.
That's great.
That's an amazing story.
There's so much I want to dive into in there, because I think it's the first thing is, it sounds to me like you've got all of the right pieces to be in the role you've got today. Yet you talk about imposter syndrome. You mentioned that you're the poster child, or you think of yourself in the imposter syndrome quite synonymously. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how those two play off each other when you think about it.
So, you know, the biggest or most glaring instance of imposter syndrome for me was getting this latest role. If you look at my resume and then you look at this role, I feel like folks would be like, you're not qualified for this. I really had never, in fact, managed a team of people, right? So if you look at or you think about the typical way HR recruiters work or promotions work in corporations, they would say, you were basically an individual contributor and now you're a VP. Like that, no, you don't get to skip 3 levels at once. But that's essentially what I did. And it really is because this organization was willing to take a risk on me. Quite frankly, I think they did. It's paid off, and they're very happy, I think, with that decision. But on paper, I think I was missing some things that they would have been looking for. But thankfully, I had done a lot of the legwork to elevate my profile, to demonstrate that I was capable of this, even if I hadn't already done it before, right? It's that sort of catch-22 where they're like, we want you to have management experience in order to be a manager. But then how do I get the first one, right? And so I had done enough other things to make my resume more robust and to establish my credibility as an expert in the field, even if I hadn't had this title before. And it was things like speaking at conferences and writing articles and blogs and getting on the board for the SCCE and HCCA. And all of those things demonstrated my ability, at least when it came to compliance, so that even if the leadership skills or capacity was an unknown, it wasn't an unknown all around. Right. And so, you know, when I look, I try not to think about what the paper version said, or, you know, says or said back then at least, and now look back and recall some of those successes and wins to remind myself, like, no, you do belong here. I have to recall those examples of success to remind myself that I have a seat and I should occupy it. And it's not for someone else, it's for me.
If I could editorialize, there is no way that we should think that current HR hiring practices are either healthy or robust. And therefore, the way it's done, it doesn't mean that don't look at the fact that you don't have the right things on paper as an indicator that that's the way the process is supposed to work. I've been a hiring manager for 20 plus years, and the best hires have been the ones that don't fit the mold.
Mhm.
I'm the poster child for that, right? I absolutely am, and I think I've challenged some of that, and I think I've raised or opened some eyes, even in my own organization, about that. I was fortunate enough again to have someone in my life who, a mentor for me, who said, some people just do better the higher up the chain they go.
Mhm.
It's almost like the opposite of that. I think it's the Peter principle, where it's, people will max out at a certain point. Or it's also like when you're a child in school and you're bored. So you start acting out because you're just not challenged.
Yep.
I actually think, I'd been waiting for this role for a long time. And even going to conferences, I would sit in sessions and I'd be like, oh, that's fascinating. I would love to do that. But it wasn't something that applied to the organization or the role that I was in at the time. But I tucked it away. I have a file in my desk of all of those sessions so that I could pull them out when it was time. And that's just a metaphor for the experiences in general. I've tried to model the leaders that I admire. And I've called on all of those previous experiences to be ready for my chance. Like when I got called up, from the minor leagues, I was ready. And I think that's paid off over time.
It sounds like Hamilton, just gonna make sure that you take that shot, right?
Make a shot.
Yep,
Yeah.
pretty much.
It's interesting because there's a little bit of a theme here. When we had Nate Chesson on, he said, look, I was applying for different positions and I wanted them and I felt like I could do them, but sometimes it's just a question of timing and preparation. So you can be fully prepared. And if the timing's not right, it's not going to happen. And sometimes you're not quite ready, but the timing's right and you go for it.
Yeah, if you ask any loved one in my life today, they will tell you that my strategy for this job was just to fake it and hope no one noticed, right? Like you said, Dan, like, oh my God, is today the day they realize I'm not qualified? And I was just like, I'm not cut out for this, but I'm going to give it my best. And turns out that that's just a lie, right? And the part about the leadership and the management of the team and all of that stuff, like that's something I'm absolutely continuing to learn and work on. I'm well aware that I still have leadership experience to gain, right? But the compliance stuff I actually do know about, right? And it was only through those opportunities that I was able to recognize that. So for example, I had done a code of conduct revision in my last role, and it was a project I was really proud of, and I still pull out that code and reference it, even though I don't work there anymore. But now at Cardinal, I realized that the code hadn't been updated in a long time, and it was basically a policy document, and it was literally like two-dimensional, right? There was no color, no life, no reason for an employee to care. And I said, I know how to do this. This is something we need, and this is something I've done before. So let's do it, right? And you often hear leadership experts say, find early wins, right? Like find things that you can accomplish early on. It helps you establish credibility. It helps you build relationships and all of those things. And so I looked for things that I knew how to do so that I could establish those early wins while I figured out the rest, because I'm still figuring out the rest when it comes to this organization. It's a different type of work. I moved from the utilities industry to healthcare, so I'm still learning a lot about that. But compliance is the same no matter where you're doing it, right? The content and the type of regulations that you're working around, those may be different, but a code is a code is a code, no matter where you go, right? And so I just tried to look for the things that I knew how to do to prove to myself I could do it. And I'm figuring out the rest as I go.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the listeners, whether they're listening live or on replay, have asked questions around like, how do you move from one industry to another? And there have been a lot of struggles because particularly in highly regulated industries, um, there tends to be this, well, either financial services or you don't, or healthcare or you don't, or higher ed or you don't. And there's a reticence in some cases to hire from outside the core of that industry. Like, what would you say to that?
So if this was a cursing friendly zone, I
Which
might
it
use
might
another
be.
I might use another term because I have a potty mouth. But my PC response would be that it's BS. And I think it's an opportunity for you to explain why in the interview. So I had that question. That question came up in my interview from at least one of the people I sat before. And my response is very similar to what I said before about compliance is the same. Like how you implement a compliance program is the same no matter what type of industry. And quite frankly, especially for this level of a role, I didn't have compliance experts interviewing me. I had the CEO and the CFO and the GC, right? Those folks don't necessarily understand what it means to stand up a compliance program. So I explained to them that the 7 elements are the same no matter the industry, right? And I know how to do that. So the rest I can learn. And I think that educational piece is important because you need to be able to articulate it to them and you need to be able to sell yourself to them. That's the biggest piece for me, I think. And I think I had something else in mind, but I totally forgot. So if it comes back, I'll share that as well. I don't think, oh, okay, yes. The other piece was, I also think you should know your limits and what you're comfortable with when it comes to changing industries. So for example, I know that one of my weaknesses is corporate finance. I don't really understand a lot of the big complicated things around financing and structures like that. I should probably go find like a mini MBA to do something like that, right? And that's on my own development plan. But that also means that I just generally don't speak finance very well. It's basically like French. And so I don't want to go work at a financial institution because I know the learning curve for me would be very, very sharp. It's just something that's not necessarily in my wheelhouse. But things like utilities or healthcare are, even just for simple reasons that I grew up in a healthcare family. My dad's a doctor, my mom was a nurse. I listened to healthcare at the dinner table, right? So I sort of just have a fundamental understanding of how the system works. And I had done some of that earlier in my career. So my first 2 roles were healthcare related. I had a 7 or 8 year hiatus over in the utility space, and now I'm back in healthcare. So I also used that to say, I've at least got some of the understanding, even if I've forgotten some of it over the last 8 years, and it'll be recall as opposed to learning from scratch. Whereas if Charlotte is a huge banking industry and location, and I just don't ever want to have to go work for one of the banks because I just don't speak finance. And so I think knowing your boundaries and knowing what would be an easy transition for you will make a big difference in your success once you get the job, right? Getting the job is one thing, but I also know I have a much smaller chance of being successful in that role, even if I were to get it.
Yeah, and I think that also reinforces some of the the nonlinear academic process that you took, and we heard this from Lisa Fine a few weeks ago, around nonlinear paths that enable you to learn how to learn, not just learn what it takes for the role.
Yeah.
And I think that please weigh in on that and how that's been. Have you seen that been beneficial versus people who come into a role? I know all the right things for today, but then struggle when the world changes a little bit around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can tie it back to Lisa Beth, your point around timing. I was absolutely one of those millennials who was like, I want to be a manager today, and I've been in this role for 2 years. I'm ready for more, and some of that may have been justified in the sense that I know I am capable of doing more, and I do learn quickly and do grow tired of the same old thing every day, right? But
don't worry about that in compliance, because
well,
it'll never be the same.
and quite frankly, that's when people say, what do you love about compliance? That's one of the things I talk about. Like when you answer your desk phone, you have no idea what's going to be on the other end, right? So I do love that. But I suffered from some of that entitlement that you often hear about in the millennial generation. And so it took staying put to see the benefit of it. So for example, my last role I took because my boss had been in that company and in that position for quite a long time. We're talking not the position, but the company, like 37 years. And he said in my interview that he was looking for his successor. And so, you know, that in my head equated to a path up, right? Like there was a path for growth for me there. And so I got into that role, and I gave like a year or two transition period, and he would retire. And year one came and went, year two came and went, year three came and went. And I was ultimately there for about 4 years before I made this move over here. But the experience I gained in those 4 years was absolutely worth staying put for those 4 years. And it gave me direct experience with social capital at organizations, right? So you often hear about millennials. I was one of them who jumped companies or positions every year or two. And what you don't get when you do that is the opportunity to build relationships, which make your work smoother and faster and smarter, right? Because you can't do it by yourself. And so being able to say, hey, I don't know what to do with this, but Susie over in finance does. I'm going to call Susie. It takes time to figure out the Susies in the organization and who will be helpful, and to make those connections and relationships. And I did that over that 4-year period. And so now I have a much greater respect.
And make it so Susie wants to help you.
And make it so Susie wants to help you, right? And so, you know, being able to gain that experience and learn from that has really made a huge difference to how I approach opportunities going forward.
So we got a great series of questions in the chat. So the first one is, like, what online program did you get your master's in ethics and compliance through, and would you recommend it? Did you think about other programs, and what factored into your decision?
Okay, so I'm so glad you asked this question. This is like, if I had a soapbox, I would pull it out right now. And I would on it.
All right, we're preparing ourselves.
Okay.
Do we need the no, this is not a sponsor disclaimer here?
Yes, I do, but I'll get to that in a second. So the first piece of my soapbox rant is that I think organizations that hire only lawyers or structure compliance roles as compliance counsel, meaning they require a lawyer to do the work, are doing themselves a huge disservice. Compliance professionals can be awesome at their jobs and not have a law degree. And that was part of my motivation for pursuing the degree that I did. I did not want to go to law school and get a law degree and never practice law. That didn't seem to make any sense to me, but I struggled to understand what the growth path looked like for me. I knew a graduate degree would likely be something they would want. I just didn't want it to be a law degree. So I set out looking for something that felt more in line with what I wanted to do. I knew compliance was what I wanted to do. So speaking of academic fits and starts, I started a master's of health degree when I was up in New York, and it turned out that that wasn't the right deal for me. $13,000 in loans with no degree later. I shifted tracks a few years later and went back to do this business ethics and compliance degree. And so at the time, it's a few years ago now, there weren't many of them in the marketplace at all. I think I found like somewhere between 3 and 5 options to look at. One of them was healthcare specific, which I wasn't interested in at the time because I was in the utility space still. But I just evaluated the programs that were available. A couple of them do typically have tables at the vendor halls at compliance conferences. And the one that I decided to go with was the New England College of Business. I think it's merged and now called Cambria College, if you look for it. And here's my disclaimer. I am not a paid spokesperson. I have no affiliation to the degree or the school. But I will happily tell anybody to give it a shot because it really was a fantastic program for me. And I think for most sort of continuing education working adults. The courses, it's like a 10 course degree. Each course is 6 weeks or so at a time. Each course assignments and workload is structured the same. So you have like discussions and things that are due on Wednesday and you have a paper due on Sunday. And that's how it is for every week. So once you get into a sort of cadence, it's really predictable, which means you can organize your life around it and make it work for you. And so I just loved it. And it's affordable. It's not a $200,000 law degree, put it that way. And I think I was done in about 15 months. With loans I could manage. There's a discount if you're an SCCE member and some other like sort of discount options. If your corporation pays for it, you can structure your courses in a way where you never have to outlay cash. And it was just a really great program. And I received some feedback from that last boss that said, when he hired me, he told me that there were 100 applicants for my job, but I was the only one who had a master's in compliance and ethics. And that made me stand out from the crowd because he said it was a demonstration of my commitment to the profession and that this is what I really wanted to do. So I had tangible feedback that degree made a real difference in my career path.
Wow. And I will say, to be fair to some of the other degrees out there, we've had Colleen Dorsey speak, and she's at St. Thomas, and they've got a program.
Yes.
And we're about to have Robert Mascola from Fordham come and speak, which also has another compliance-related program. So I think the landscape is continuing to
Yes.
grow and develop. And it's exciting to hear that there are these opportunities that are out there, and ones that fit in for working adults too.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I would love to be able to do more of, even through the CCC or other organizations, is to get the word out to that college kid who has no idea compliance is a profession. I didn't know, nobody told me in college that I could do this. And so there are many more degree opportunities out there that are available now. There's also, certificates as opposed to a full degree, which are shorter, more manageable in workload maybe. There's plenty of opportunities. That's just the experience that I had with that one program.
Right. And there's some commentary in the chat that, these compliance graduate programs weren't available when they were looking. So some people went into risk management. Along the same lines, there are questions about your early wins. So we have a question in the chat that talks about how do you balance early wins with the initiatives you knew how to tackle, and the day-to-day running of the compliance and ethics function, along with all of the fires that happen. Like, even though the code might be rewrite might be an exciting thing, but what if it's not on fire? Like, how do you sit there and prioritize and like find the easy wins and not get burned out in the process?
So I think it depends a little bit about when you start, where you are in your goal cycle, like where you are in your year, right? So I joined in June, and our new year starts in July. So it was goal creating time. So I had some autonomy around the design of our next 12 months. So I'll put that out there in fairness, right? But I think again, it comes back to the fundamentals of a program. If you've got the 7 elements, you need to do some sort of assessment of what you have and where your gaps are and where you need to go. I think it's also critical to ask in the interview process and then through the goal setting for your own personal goals, what does success look like, right? What do the people who hired you want you to accomplish? And then there needs to be some balancing act where you say, well, you want me to do this, but actually, have you seen these things over here? Like, they're really bad and we should do something about them too. And so you need to be able to advocate for what the program needs and then find your wins within that bucket, right? Depending on the maturity of your program or where you report in the organization, the higher up you are in the food chain, the more decision making you have about your own destiny. And so if you can find things that satisfy what they think they want, because you've got to give them some of that, right? You can't come in and say, you hired me for these reasons, but none of them matter anymore. Like that will never go over well, right? So you've got to give them
You were
some of
just
the,
wrong.
thanks for hiring me, but you guys have got it all wrong. Like that's just never going to land well, right? So you've got to give them some of what they want, but you've also got to think about what your program really needs and find, it's like the Venn diagram with like the overlapping circles, right? What is in the middle of those things, what you need, what they want, and what you do well, and find some things in that area.
Right.
So to bring this back, that's a great bridge back to life in the office versus life in each of our own minds when it comes to work, and the idea of being that. How do you when it comes back to the imposter syndrome, to working every day and trying to make forward progress? How have you been able to use either cues from the organization or cues from yourself to help balance out that voice that says, hey, I'm not achieving, I'm not accomplishing? What can
Yeah.
people look for in their own days, in their own experiences, to help start to balance out that inner monologue?
I think it is about taking a step back and relying on other people in your life to validate some of that for you, even if you can't, right? So, if you could have like an out of body experience where you stepped back and said, okay, let me look legitimately and independently look at what I've accomplished over the last 5 or 10 years or however long it is, write down those things so that you can recall them in the future and say, no, voice in my head, actually look at all this stuff we did and we belong here, right? So I think it is an active and intentional acknowledgement of the reality of the situation, not what the voice in your head is telling you. And then I think you can also, some of those things include speaking at conferences, writing articles, being invited to come and talk to you guys today, right? I believe that you believe in me, even if I don't. And the fact that I'm here today is proof of that, right? So looking back at those things. And then, I don't also want to pretend that everything will be rainbows and butterflies every time, right? Like there are some things that don't go according to plan or aren't as successful, but look to cues from those you work with as well and ask for them. So, for example, I thought for sure that I wasn't going to last in this current role, but I actually did really well in my first performance review, right? Because I had found some things that I could demonstrate we were good at, right? Or that we had accomplished. So every time I think I'm not cut out and I won't make it the next 6 months, I pull out that performance review and I'm like, no, you did fine and you were doing fine, so look to those cues that they give you in your performance evaluation, but also seek out advice or seek out feedback in other places. So we just went through a 360-degree feedback process, and this was the first time I had ever participated in one where I was being evaluated. And I will tell you, it's a very vulnerable process.
Yeah.
You have to be vulnerable in order for it to be successful, right? Because you could get the feedback and be like, this is garbage, and put it in your desk drawer and dismiss it, or you can be willing to take a look at it. And so that's the way I approached it, and have tried to really be intentional about the development. Like, where are the things I need to work on? Because none of us are perfect. None of us have it all figured out, and none of us are, the perfect leader even. And so one of the phrases that I love most in my personal life is this concept that we're all just walking each other home. And it's talking about like life is just about walking you home to heaven or whatever the after is, right? We're all just walking each other home, because I think it sort of speaks to equality, and we're all the same. And I liken that to my career path and my approach as a leader, because if I'm giving feedback to the folks on my team, then I should be willing to receive it just the same, right? And I do not have this figured out. And so please, you're on my career journey just as much as I'm on yours, and I've got a long way to go. So will you walk this with me too, right? one of the things I asked my team to do recently was, if I speak up, or if I'm speaking out of turn, or if I'm like being a little dominant in the conversation, which I am candidly known to do, kick me under the table. Like, send me a Teams message behind the scenes and say, you're doing it again, because I don't always have the awareness in the moment. And I need that feedback for people to show me and to share with me so I can learn from it. And so you've got to seek out the guideposts that you can refer to, both positive and opportunities for improvement. Because nobody, if you're not looking for them, and if you're not committed to working on them, then others will make it a less pleasant process for you.
So one of the things I remember you saying, Dan, at one point in time is that often you would open up your conversations with your direct reports with a, how am I doing?
Yeah,
And
any feedback session it ends with, any feedback session out ends with a mandatory, I need to know too, so how can I do my job better?
yeah, and I think that's tremendous. It's something that people all too often forget, right? Relationships aren't unidirectional.
No.
But it's easy to forget.
Well, that requires a level of vulnerability that is not, not in line with the idea of, managers. And with managers, it's not in line with, as leadership has evolved as a skill, it's much more in line with that, but it's not a default.
Right.
One of the things I try to do, partially because I really don't know any different, or I don't know any better, is to remain a human, and to show up like a human. Because, so for example, Dan and I were chatting a little earlier, and I mentioned that one of my strategies for dealing with stressful situations, or times where I feel like I don't belong, or I haven't earned the seat at the table, I remind myself that everybody else in the room put their pants on the same way that day. And again, that's sort of just like an equalizer, right? Leveling of the playing field. These people, these chiefs, are just like me. And if you don't complicate it, it usually goes over better, right? And so I try to be a human with my team, because they're all humans and I want them to show up like humans too. We had a conversation a few weeks ago around like well-being and wellness on our team, because we're all trying to deal with burnout and COVID and politics and all of the stuff that's going on right now. And I say all the time, if you need time off, if anything's going on, like, take care of you and your family first. But it sometimes falls flat because they think a VP is saying it as opposed to a peer or a friend. And so I spent the first 10 or 15 minutes of a team meeting recently talking about how I had an awful fall, quite frankly. I had COVID. I was thankful and very fortunate that I was symptom free, but I still had to isolate alone for 2 weeks. And every day I woke up thinking today was the day I was going to get sick. So it has like this own weird set of stuff that goes along with it. I had a best friend die tragically from an overdose in November, which was horrible, as you can imagine, right? But life goes on. In December, I actually did get very sick with something, I don't know what it was, if it was COVID part 2, but I was very, very sick in December for a few weeks. And then I had a crisis with my dad in January, and it's just been one of those one thing after another times. And I shared with them that by December, I was really burnt out. Like, whether you guys saw it, I'd be ignorant to think you didn't, but I'm going to acknowledge that I was really burnt out. And I was able to take some time over the holidays and care for myself. And I really did come back in January refreshed. But I was very intentional about doing that and inviting my direct reports to do the same with their teams, to show that even managers and directors and VPs get burnt out, and it's okay to do what you need to do to care for yourself. And so, being vulnerable, like, gosh, that to me, I felt all kinds of exposed doing that, right? Because I feel like I'm supposed to have it together every day. And that's just not how it works. Like in the little description for this session, I talked about how you're supposed to have it all figured out. and I don't have it all figured out every day, but none of us do. And that's actually what makes life fun. Like, that's what's exciting about what we get to do every day when we wake up, is the fact that we don't know what's going to happen. And being human and staying human is the only way I know how to get through it.
That second half of your sentence, I think, is really important, and I'm going to restate it. That I don't know what I'm doing, but nobody else does either.
No.
That second half is key to overcoming the first half.
Yeah, because so one of the other things is I talk about grace, and not in like a religious sense, but the sense of like just giving everybody some room. That other really common quote around, everyone is fighting a war you know nothing about, be kind. Everybody is dealing with something, and everybody's got their own unique set of struggles. So give them grace, right? Let them be, let them make mistakes, let them have a bad day. Like, everybody has a right to have a bad day, and so nobody else has it all figured out. So you don't have to either. Gosh, I hope I remember that tomorrow when I wake up again, because it's so true,
Well,
like,
feel free to call me and I'll remind you.
Well, but
because I think it's really important that we remind each other of
each other. Right. Exactly. Because if I only listen to the voice in my head, I'd have myself convinced that I'm not worthy, right? But if I listen to those that I surround myself with, whether it's loved ones, peers at work, professionals in the industry, spiritual advisors, whoever it is, friends are awesome, right? Those are the people who believe in you. And if we all believed in ourselves nearly as much as those people do, we'd be rock stars.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've heard other people doing, I know that a friend of this group, Mary Shirley, went out and asked for adjectives from people that she cared about, who she respected their opinions, because just remembering how other people view you allows you to say, oh yeah, that's true about me, and I can live that, because not only is it true, but other people see it too. And so having those kind of like best friend commentary, kind of like your performance review, is very, very helpful sometimes to just kind of recenter and ground people in what reality actually is.
So I'm going to just keep spitting out quotes from other people, because none of this is my original content, right? Like, I'm not claiming ownership of any of this, but there's a Marianne Williamson quote that goes something along the lines of, why me? Child, why not you? Right? And it's that concept of like, why not me? That I try to remember. There's always that voice that's like, whatever opportunity it is, even something like this, why do they want to hear from me? Why not hearing from you? Royce now early on was one of my biggest mentors and supporters. And at a conference, he said, you should write for us. And I said, about what? And he said, no, really, you should write for us. And I said, what can I possibly say that someone else hasn't already said much better than I could ever come up with? And he was like, you are not listening to me. We need your voice. We need to hear from you. You have something to say, whether you think you do or not. And we need you in the conversation. And having that voice to refer back to, right? When the imposter starts talking, and to surround yourself with people who believe in you, is the only way I've been able to find my journey forward.
So one of the challenges that continues to come up is the imposter being the barrier to taking another step. And I know you're also part with both Lisa Beth and I and a cast of others on the corporate career connection program, where we're trying to bridge people that are looking for jobs with those that can help to try and get them ready, interview questions, mock interviews, elevator pitches, things like that, and just generally building out their network. As people come upon these forks in the road where they go to decide to make a change in their career, and they look at a job description and say, I'm not qualified, or they talk themselves out of it. Do you have any advice or thoughts for people as they're at that juncture, other than signing up for the compliance career connection to try and build out your network?
Yeah. Shameless plug. Come hang out with us.
Yeah, we're actually, for those who are interested, tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern, it's free, no sponsors.
Tonight,
no,
there's a session. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So other than that, Yeah, the other cliche I hope you take away from this is don't disqualify yourself, right? There's no reason to not give it a shot, right? I talked to someone recently, I think they're in the audience, you know who you are. They shared with me that part of the reason they just got their latest position was because they were, again, very intentional about their career path. And when they sat down with their boss at the time, they said, so where do you see yourself in 5 years? And she said, in your chair. Like, as blunt as could be, right? Like, I want, you are a gifted and capable woman and you know what you're doing. And I hope that means that you won't be in that seat for long. And when it becomes open, I want an opportunity to fill it. And that determination is what you need, because again, nobody's going to care about your career path more than you do, right? So she didn't, when it turned out that that opportunity didn't come along, she applied for jobs that she thought she could do even if she didn't meet the requirements on paper, and lo and behold, she got one, right? And that's how this works sometimes. So just, you never know, and you will never know until you try. So if you're disqualified for other reasons, so be it, but don't disqualify yourself.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting. One of the things that I keep hearing from people is, well, I don't want to get a bunch of rejection letters. And no, I'm telling you, I hear this all the time. Like, I don't want to apply for
refraining.
jobs that I'm not qualified for. I don't want a whole bunch of rejection letters, right? And yet, if you never get any rejection letters, it's simply because you didn't try.
You didn't try.
Right.
And there's very clearly a difference between me applying for a CCO role and me applying for a CFO role. I have literally zero qualifications. We've already established that for a CFO, right? And so, there's applying for things you have no business applying for, and then there's applying for things that are a stretch, right? Where you meet some of the requirements, but maybe not all, or where there are those arbitrary things like you have to have 5 years of management experience, or you have to have, this degree, or this, or, unfortunately, those automated systems that review resumes are really difficult to deal with. And they're real, right? But half the time you get rejected by those, not even by people, right? Not even by someone who's actually looked at your resume.
Right.
And so, that's
when the
where,
rejection comes back in
Automated
30
system.
seconds.
right. And you're like, okay. And clearly, like, my emotions are typically written all over my face. So I apologize for like me making funny faces at the questions before I even get to answer them. But I don't take those rejections personally. And I know that there's been some conversations around, use some of it as practice, and make sure you are intentional about crafting each application to the role. And you need to know that if you get the interview, how are you going to tell them that you're qualified, right? Like, how are you going to tell your story so that you can convince them you belong? And again, if you can't do it, it's very rare, very unlikely that the hiring manager is going to say, well, gee, I'm not really sure she can do this job. She didn't really convince me she could, but I'm going to give her a chance anyway. No, that's not how it happens. It is likely, though, that if they say, well, she doesn't really have this or this, but she has these other things, and she was really clear about how those things translate to what we need her to do. And I really liked her otherwise. And, she's clearly smart and she's done all this other stuff. I'm going to give her a try. Like, that happens, right? And so you've got to be able to sell yourself in order to get there.
Yeah.
And we had
you can't count. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say, we had a great conversation with Jackie Cheslow, who is also another volunteer for the Compliance Career Connections group, just about like, hey, if you've got an area that's not a strength, or it's a gap, know how you're going to solve it, and be able to articulate that from the get-go, saying, hey, I don't know about this, but these are the 5 ways that or the 2 ways I'm going to find out more. And I want your support in that, because I know I can do this job.
Yeah, that's absolutely a question they asked me. How are you going to get up to speed on our business? You need to be able to answer that question, right? And I will say that the other reason I think this job was a possibility for me is I was very intentional in preparing for the interviews. I have a set of like 60 or 70 questions that I've accumulated over all of my interviews, where I will sit down and practice them, not so that I regurgitate them word for word, but so that I can be prepared if I get them. So I have an answer to what's your weakness, what are your biggest strengths. Tell me about a time when this didn't work, or tell me about a time when you worked with a cohort worker you hated. Tell me about a time you missed a deadline. How are you going to get up to speed? What will your 30, 60, 90-day plan? Like, a lot of the questions don't really change interview to interview in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. And if you practice, you just are so much more prepared. And so I had a folder of all of the, some examples that I could and was allowed to share of things I'd done in the past. I had examples of my articles and my conference
Mhm.
presentations. I had prepared for hours before the meeting and all of the interviews. I had researched the people. Like, I did all of the things that they tell you to do, and it works. That's the other message I hope people take away from this session today is, generally what they tell you to do works. Like, I went to conferences and I networked and I did all of these other things, and it paid off. I'm literally the poster child for getting involved in your industry and stepping out of your own little bubble and making a place for yourself in the, whether it's the social media world or the real life world. And it pays off. It takes time. I went to my first conference in 2013, right? So 8 years ago, I started on this journey of elevating my profile, but over time, it pays off.
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions in the chat, although we're starting to run low on time, believe it or not. Um, a couple of questions, if you're not actually going for a role that stretches you, aren't you kind of staying in the same place? And what do you think about companies and hiring managers who only look to hire people who meet the exact job criteria? Do you think they just don't have any interest in providing support or ongoing education?
I think it's probably just like, they don't know what they don't know. So, similar to like explaining how compliance can transfer between industries, I think explaining to those hiring managers what they're missing out on if you're given the opportunity, and why they consider you for the role, I think goes a long way. I wouldn't necessarily, like, I think I've made a lateral move 3 times in my career, right? And again, same story. Each of those roles gave me something to learn, right? And none of those times in my career were wasted by making a lateral move, whether it was a different organization or industry or city or paycheck, like whatever it was, it all happens for a reason, and it all worked out for me. If they say you have to have done this exact role before, I don't know that makes a whole lot of sense, right? And I would love to think that it's as easy as saying, well, is that who you want to go work for, right? Like,
Yeah.
don't you want to work for somebody who sees it a little bit differently? But in today's workforce and in this world, sometimes you do have to just take a job to get a paycheck. That's a real thing,
Yeah.
And if that's your
Mhm.
situation, I wouldn't hesitate to take a lateral move.
So we are getting at the end of our
Yeah.
time. And Dan,
Yeah.
you want to ask our
So
signature question?
yeah. So as we end each session, we ask the same question of everybody. Samantha, what is the best thing you've ever learned from a mentor?
Something new that I haven't already said, or
Yeah, I should say this whole last hour has all been things you've learned from a mentor, but of it, if you had to pick the best, what was the best?
um, it's probably we need your voice message, because like I said, didn't believe that I had anything to say. But the fact is, regardless of gender or other demographic um, characteristics, it's not about that kind of diversity. It's about the diversity of thought. And by hearing him say, "We need your voice," it was validation that I had something to say and that somebody cared. Um, and um, it was against that voice in my head that said, "You're only however years old, and you haven't been doing this long enough, and you don't have anything to say." I just, again, we need all of you. You all have something to say. And I hope I get to hear from you what it is, because it's only by doing that and listening to others that I continue to grow and learn. So I think if it were one thing, it would be that.
That's a
I love it.
wonderful lesson. It's
I
a
think that's going to be
wonderful
a
thing to remember.
great social tile. Then we're going to have some more follow up from this for sure.
The last thing I would like to just close with, and I hope everybody will hear, is if I can sit in this chair, if I can sit in this role, having not graduated college in 4 years, having taken a break, having gotten started late, having all of the things that are not representative of the perfect career path. If I can sit here, you can too. There's no reason that you can't be where I am or wherever it is that you want to go. This isn't the end of the road for me either, right? But wherever it is that you want to go, you can get there.
Love it. I can't wait to see the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth act.
Me too. I have no idea what's coming, but that again is part of the fun. So
it'll be something spectacular.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And Samantha, thank you so much for being here and for sharing all these great insights and giving people perspective on the fact that we don't all have it figured out.
No, thank you for having me and for giving me something else to write down on my list of things that I've done so that I can say, no, Dan and Lisa Beth think I had something important to say. And you know, that's just more reason to quiet that imposter voice. So thank you again.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next week for another event. Take care.